Thanks for coming out for Science Unwrapped. It's great to see you here. I'm Nancy Huntley from the College of Science team that puts together the Science Unwrapped program. And so I'm here to welcome you and to tell you a little how the Science Unwrapped program works and then introduce our speaker for the night. But before I do that, I want to introduce one other person that we have in our audience tonight. So here in the college, we have a new leader this year, a new dean, Dr. Maura Hagen, and she's just begun here and is with us in the audience tonight. So I'd like to ask her to stand up, and so you'll know who she is. Thank you. She's an atmospheric scientist, so she studies motions and of the sort that Joe studies in water that he'll be talking about later, and its interaction with space weather. So anything with space weather has to be very cool, I think. So the way Science Unwrapped works is we have a speaker who will talk for about 45 minutes, and then at the end of that time, we're not quite done in here. We'll have time, about 15 minutes for questions and answers with him, but then at 8 p.m. we'll adjourn, and you can go out in the hallways. And in the halls, you probably saw on your way in, there are a lot of people here with fun stuff to learn and play with set up. So you can learn about beaver, rivers, other mammals, bugs, water, chemistry, physics, all sorts of things. So when Joe is done speaking, please stay in your seats for a few more minutes unless you absolutely have to leave. And if you do have to leave, leave very quietly, and then we'll let you come on down and talk to him more or play in the halls. Okay? So our speaker tonight is Dr. Joe Wheaton. Joe's a professor in the Department of Watershed Sciences here in the Quinney College of Natural Resources, and he is a hydrologist by training. He grew up in California, and he came to Utah first when he was an undergraduate. He actually was an Aggie. He enrolled here and thinking he would become an engineer. And after 2 years, he had an internship which looked like it could become a job, and that seemed pretty attractive. So he took a job working as a consultant, and a lot of his work was with rivers, with restoring rivers and protecting rivers and land development. And he decided that he actually liked working with rivers a whole lot more than he had liked the other work he was doing. So he went back to school and he studied hydrology, basically how water moves and all the work that moving water does, first at California, and then he did his PhD in England, farther and farther away from Utah. He studied geography there, and after he finished his degree, he had a job as a faculty member in Wales, maybe a tiny bit closer to us, but not very much. And then he decided to come back to the U.S. So first he was in Idaho for a year as a professor, and then he got a job here in the Department of Watershed Sciences. And he's been here 7 years?
6.
6 years. It's a long time. So Joe does a lot of work with river restoration, and he's done some really interesting and innovative novel work looking at how you can use natural processes, nature's engineers, to restore rivers, and that's what he'll talk to you about this evening. So the title of his talk is Leave It to Beavers.
Great. Thanks so much, Nancy, and thanks everybody for coming out. I'm going to see if we can dim the lights here. So can you all hear me okay? Oh, yeah. Are there any football fans here? A few. So why are you here? Well, apparently there's some sporting event tonight, but we won't talk about that. So I want to talk to you tonight about something that I have to confess I feel a little bit of a fraud standing up here and talking to you about beavers, because I'm a guy who studies rivers from sort of a physical perspective. And so I'm going to talk to you about beaver, and I think this is kind of a throwback to, like Nancy mentioned, my earlier days in engineering. And I got involved in studying beaver really because of this guy, Nick Bowis, who's sitting right here, dragged me out and took me out to look at a restoration project and quantify some of what the beaver were doing to these streams and rivers and how they were changing those places. And I also want to start off by just acknowledging there's a bunch of folks here from the Fluvial Habitat Center. We've got a huge number of collaborators and funders that have made a lot of the story that I'm going to share with you tonight and sort of try to synthesize down possible. And so we owe them and many others that aren't listed a big thanks. So what I want to share with you tonight, the purpose of tonight's story really, is to talk about what lessons we can learn from beaver. And so beaver are an ecosystem engineer, and they're incredibly talented engineer. One of the things that's kind of interesting, I'm in a watershed sciences department, so I study rivers and streams. We also, in our college, we have a wildland resources department, and folks there study rangelands and uplands. And beaver don't really care about our sort of disciplines and our silos. What beaver are really good at is, we draw these artificial lines in the sand, and that sort of interface between these is this so-called riparian zone. It's a really important sort of hotspot on the landscape. What beaver do is blur these boundaries. They come in, they build their dams, and that expands this riparian fringe. It makes this a much more interesting stream environment. And so what I want to share to you tonight is what are they doing, why are they doing that, and what can we learn from it to maybe better manage our streams and rivers. So can anybody help me out with what an ecosystem engineer is? Has anybody heard this term before? Nobody's going to be brave here. So an ecosystem engineer is an animal that modifies the environment for their own purposes. They're modifying the environment to make it a better place for them to live, but in the process, they're creating much better habitat for a whole host of other species as well. And so beaver are the classic ecosystem engineers, and so maybe an easier question, what is it that they're known for? What is their classic engineering feat that they are so good at? Building dams, right? And so we're gonna tonight walk through and try and understand why beaver spend so much time and energy on this. And then we'll get into talking about the impacts that they have on various things like stream flow and on other species. And then we'll talk about the sort of sad state of many of our rivers. And a lot of our rivers are in poor shape, and we spend a lot of money on restoration. And one of the big lessons is maybe beaver can help us with some of those things. And then we'll wrap up with some of the work that our group is doing on trying to better understand where we might be able to apply those lessons. And so just a little bit of history to get us all on the same page. Cache Valley was originally settled, not settled, but originally explored because of beaver, right? Trappers came here. So Jim Bridger from Cache Valley came here and in search of beaver pelts and furs to make these things. So fashion drove a lot of the original settlement of North America and exploration of North America, and it was the fur trade. And so if you really want a fascinating read on this, I'd suggest Eric J. Dolan's book, Fur, Fortune, and Empire, that sort of tracks this. And historically, estimates put the beaver population in North America at somewhere between 60 and 400 million beaver. And what happened in search of pelts to make these beautiful hats, we pretty much harvested them to near extinction by the late 1800s. And currently, the estimates, their populations are about 6 to 12 million. And so even though they were really heavily over-harvested, they still hung on in a few places. And this is a range map. And so the dark gray is where beaver are thought to exist. Historically, it's actually a little bit wrong. A lot of these places in Nevada and California still historically had beaver populations. And they now occupy most of that historic range. So those little populations that held on did make their way back. And so what we want to do is try and understand what beaver are doing as an ecosystem engineer and get inside the head of these guys and understand why they put so much energy into building these dams. So I like to refer to beaver as an undiscriminating rodent. A more politically correct way of describing this might be a habitat generalist. They're highly adaptable. We find them in lakes. We find them on rivers and streams. You can find beaver in the Grand Canyon, for example. We find them on abandoned channels of floodplains. We find them in wetlands. We find them far up north in boreal forests of Canada. And we also find them in the rivers down south in the southwest here in the middle of deserts. So they can occupy a huge range of habitats. And this habitat generalist is because they have very simple sort of ingredients that they need. It's really water and wood. And so what happens when you get up north, you get into tundra. And so we kind of have a wood limitation up there, whereas down south, we have a water and a wood limitation. And as I mentioned, this is what the sort of crude range map says, but we have plenty of beaver in these desert areas, actually. So one of the lessons from beaver is they like to make a mess. And so for parents, you may not like to hear this, but for kids, this is making a mess is a really good thing. This is, anyone recognize where this is? Temple Fork, someone said. So this is a place, a little anecdote. In 2011, there were some beaver dams, maybe a quarter of a mile downstream, and they blew out in the high flows of 2011. These guys moved up here, and in the fall, in a period of about 3 weeks, built a dozen dams here and made a complete mess of this. They took a bunch of cottonwoods, chopped them down, and they completely changed the stream from a little single-thread channel to a multi-threaded mess. And why would I think this is such a good thing? Yeah. Yeah, so they're spreading that water out and making it bigger and making better habitat, not only for them, but for a whole host of other species as well. And so we've partly gotten at why they build dams, but we haven't really sort of nailed it. So what beaver really need, and the reason that they're willing to put so much energy into building these dams, they really want to maintain an underwater entrance to their lodge. So their lodges are dry, and so they can have their young, their kits in here. And if they have an underwater entrance to their lodge, why might that be a good strategy? Yeah. Exactly. So predators don't get them, the guy says. Right? So if you have an underwater entrance, there aren't too many aquatic predators that are going to go in after these beaver. So if we have this underwater entrance, not only can we keep our families safe if we're beaver, if we have ice cover, we can also, a deeper water won't freeze all the way through, and we can store up a big food cache in the winter. So we can take a bunch of branches that beaver will eat, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we can get access to that all winter long, even if there's ice cover over the dam. And so in a system like the Grand Canyon, why wouldn't they build a dam in the Grand Canyon? It's a little bit too fast, right? Plus, the water's deep enough, and so they can build a bank lodge and they can make a living, and they don't need to. The water is deep enough to maintain that underwater entrance to their lodge. So the family unit is called a beaver colony. This consists of 5 to 8 individuals in a family, typically. Their average litters each year, they have between 2 and 5 kits, and those kits stick around and sort of learn the ropes of what it takes to maintain a healthy colony. And so they work on helping out with repairing the lodges and the dams, cutting canals, harvesting all this woody material that's used to do all this stuff. And then after a couple of years, the parents kick them out. And so what happens then is they disperse and they go off and try and find places of their own and hopefully mates of their own. And so what beaver eat, anybody, well, actually before I go there, this is a skull of a beaver, and actually there's some skulls on display outside that you can take a look at afterwards. And so beaver have these incisors, and we're going to look at a video in a second, and you'll see just how effective they are at using those to chop down trees. And we know that they use that wood in their dams, but they also eat some of that wood. So something like this is a typical size piece of wood that they might try and use in their dam. And so I'll just pass this around, and folks can play with that. Now, we like to refer to some of this sort of stuff as corn on the cob, right? Because what beaver will do is they'll hold these things in their hands and they just kind of go through and they chop off. And what they're after is the cambium, that layer underneath the bark that has that all the water and nutrients that are being pushed up from the root system, that has a lot of nutritional value in it. And so this is their sort of one of the things that they'll use for food. And I lost my thing here. I'll hand that to you, Nancy. And what most people don't realize that in the summertime, actually a good chunk of their diet isn't just this wood. A good chunk of their diet is actually just leaves and grasses and herbaceous matter that they can find. And it's in the winter that they really build up these food caches, and most of their diet then goes to this wood. Now, some people will tell you that beaver need aspen. It's not true. It's a bit like saying we need chocolate. So if beaver are given a choice, they will go for aspen. It tastes quite good to them, but they don't need it. There's lots of other things that they can survive on, and they do quite like willow, cottonwoods, any sort of the riparian hardwoods that you might find. And so to sort of illustrate some of these concepts, what I'm going to do is show you a short video. I'm going to turn the lights down for just a second here. And I'm going to apologize up front for the very cheesy music, but if you listen to the narrator and you just look at some of the visuals, I think it's much better than me just arm-waving about this stuff.
Winter is still 6 months away, but this family of beavers can't relax. They've got work to do to get themselves through the frozen months ahead. They need to change this whole environment. They've set it aside for dam building. Rocks and stones form the base, and wooden debris finishes it off. It's a mammoth undertaking, but one that they're more than capable of achieving. A single beaver can move 10 times its body weight per day, almost 500 pounds. Once all the work's done, they'll have a new home. And more importantly, somewhere to store food once the cold spell kicks in. But their food store is no simple affair. It's a high-tech solution. A deep water refrigerator. To construct that, they'll need a much bigger, deeper lake. That means building up the dam at a rate of 5 feet per day. And to increase depth, they dig mud from the river bottom and use it to plug gaps in the dam, making it watertight. After 2 months, the dam has grown to an impressive 300 feet in length, and the pond stretches back over a mile upstream. Now the beavers change tactics. A series of channels are dug out that radiate from the lake to allow easy access to trees and keep the beavers safe from predators like bears. Beavers are actually dog-sized rodents. They're the ultimate lumberjacks, with built-in chainsaws made up of powerful jaw muscles and 4 ultra-sharp incisors that constantly regrow as they wear down. They can gnaw their way through a cottonwood tree 3 feet thick in just a matter of hours. This single beaver will chop down more than 200 trees a year. And most of this wood ends up on the menu. Beavers eat bark and wood, but they'll chop down far more than they can stomach in one sitting. That's where the fridge comes in. The wood is chopped into pieces, dragged down to the bottom of the lake, and pushed into the mud to stop it from drifting away. The beaver family can store almost 150 pounds worth of wood, and low water temperatures keep the wood fresh right through the winter. But not all the wood goes into storage. Once the lake reaches a certain depth, the beavers start lodge building. This multi-chambered shelter, raised above water level, is 20 feet in diameter and houses up to 5 beavers. Come winter, these beavers will have a snug waterfront home in which to raise their young, safe from predators. And with plenty of food available from their easy-access underwater freezer.
Music isn't great, but the footage there is pretty neat, showing some of what they do. And the slides that I'm sharing with you tonight will be on the Science Unwrapped website, and there's links to lots of other videos and stuff on there if any of this stuff is of interest. One of the things that the video implies is that they build this sort of permanent home, and they do a lot of work on that. And one of the things it sort of downplays is just how often these guys move around. It turns out beaver actually maintain a lot of different homes at once, and then they can harvest an area pretty heavy. So this is up on Spawn Creek, up the canyon, and this is an area where they've harvested a ton of aspen to support some big dams here. And what they'll do is work an area really hard for a little while, but they won't just clear cut it completely. They'll work it selectively, and then they'll move on. They'll go upstream or downstream and work that area and let the area recover, and they can come back and reuse it later. And so this is an aerial view of that same dam up on Spawn Creek. And so what I want to point out here, all these little trails, these are skid trails that are going up that hillside. And they'll go as far as, well, 150 yards, like a football field and a half away, to harvest that aspen. And then they use that to build the dam, the lodge, build up their food caches. You can see this area down here. They're letting this area lay rest, and they were starting to work this area. And as they exhaust those local supplies, they'll start moving up the hill slope again, and then they'll let that area rest. And by then, this area may be doing quite well again. And one of the things we also see them do is not just build one dam like they showed us in the video, but they build lots of dams. And so you'll tend to have a primary dam, which is where the main sort of lodge is, and then a bunch of secondary dams in sort of series and sometimes in parallel. And so one of the questions I have for some of you is why would they build so many dams? Why not just build one big dam? Anybody help me out? What would be the advantage? Yeah. That's right. So she said maybe if one dam got destroyed, they'd have another one to move into. So if you have a bunch of dams like this in series, it's unlikely that they're all just going to blow out like a series of dominoes. And so it's a little bit of an inbuilt insurance policy. Another thing that it does is it makes it easier to access food. Have any of you seen a beaver waddling around on land before? Or maybe in these videos? They're easy prey, right? They're slow, they're sort of klutzy, they can't see that great, and so, if you're a coyote or a bear, this is a taste for you for sure. And so that's one reason. Another reason is, here we go. Another reason is if we have a bunch of these dams in series, it makes it easier for them to swim around. They're very graceful, very quick swimmers. And so when you have a bunch of little ponds like this, they can swim around, get away from predators quickly, move wood around to have easier access to food. And then, as was mentioned, the sort of not all our eggs in one basket insurance policy. So the next thing we want to talk about is what are the impacts of some of these activities. Some of you may have seen the National Geographic article a few years back describing some of the impacts following reintroduction of wolves and to Yellowstone on the ecosystem. And there are definitely debates about this sort of exact mechanisms and causes, but in a nutshell, before you had that top predator of wolves back in the ecosystem, the riparian areas were overgrazed primarily by elk, and you didn't have many beaver in the system. After the wolves came back in, whatever the exact cause, the riparians have recovered. Elks are not overgrazing those areas as much. Beaver have come back into the system, and in so doing have made a much richer array of habitat that's been a real magnet for lots of different wildlife. So what else is good about beaver dams other than just making habitat? Well, the dams themselves can act as these natural filters for improving water quality. They also elevate the water tables by physically building these dams. And so what you'll get is, I'm sorry about that. What you'll get here is overflow onto these floodplain surfaces. And then that will really encourage lots of extra groundwater recharge as well as raising up the water tables. And that spreads out and it allows riparian vegetation to get established. Yeah? I hadn't thought of that. So the gentleman asked, would having several dams make coyotes have to look harder for the beaver? Probably. It gives them more hiding places for sure. So that's a really good point. Another thing that we see is that it's not just water moving with rivers and streams. We also have sediment and nutrients being carried with that water. And what these dams do is they provide obstructions that fundamentally change the timing and delivery of water, sediment, and nutrients, and how long those things are stored there. And so this can do things like slow snowmelt runoff and knock the tops off of peaks, which we'll take a look at in a second. So how does flow change with dams? And to answer this question, we need to make sure we're on the same page on a couple of basic concepts. And so really what I'm asking is, if I have flow coming in at the top here, what is the impact of having all these dams on the flow going out at the bottom? And to look at this, I need to understand what flow is. And so flow is just a volume per time. And so this is just typically measured in something like cubic feet per second. And so you need to have a stopwatch, of course, to measure these sorts of things. And the volume, well, a basketball is about like a cubic foot. So you could think of this as how many basketballs can I fit through the net per second. And if I have too many basketballs at once, what's going to happen? They're going to overflow, right? So it's like a flood, of course. And so what we want to know is what happens to flow with all these dams in a system. And so this will be one of the few graphs that the only graphs that I show tonight. But this is a way of illustrating that question. And so the typical impact of beaver dams on flows, we can look at this graph, and what this is called a hydrograph. And so we've got time on the horizontal axis, and then we've got that flow concept. I keep hitting these, sorry about that. We've got that flow concept on the vertical axis. And so if we look at the blue, that trace right there, that's the hydrograph for flow coming into a series of dams. And then the typical response, if we measure that same flow downstream, is shown here in the green. And so what do you notice right away? You notice that the peaks have all been chopped off. They're a lot lower. And so we focus on this one, for example. That volume of water is not lost. It's just we've reduced the peak, and then we spread out that flow over time. And so after the flood peaks, we actually see higher flows. And so what beaver dams are doing are elevating the output the rest of the time in most cases, and lowering the peaks on some of these things. Another impact of these beaver dams is that they really create stark contrasts in the environment. So this is the Spawn Creek example I've been showing. This is just a little aerial photo from a drone. And what you have here is the stream. This is where the stream was just 2 or 3 years ago. And if we look at that, if we had an older photo, the extent of the riparian area, where a lot of the sort of willows and this green vegetation was just in these green lines. Beaver came in, put all these dams in. These willows are just 2 or 3 years old, and they spread this system out and created this much bigger riparian zone. And this is a really important sort of magnet for wildlife in these semi-arid environments. Sage grouse is a great example of this. There's been some recent work showing that sage grouse actually have much healthier and bigger populations where they're in closer proximity to having some riparian areas that have perennial flow and can provide some of this habitat. And so we've been working with folks on doing beaver restoration projects to improve these riparian areas, and it actually improves habitat for some birds that you might not expect. Some other potential negative impacts of beaver are that their dams can act as barriers to fish migration. And so this is a dam up on Temple Fork. This is a person for scale. This person is scanning for fish that have little pit tags in it and mobile antenna on there. And so there is a bumper sticker from the Pacific Northwest that says, "Beaver taught salmon to jump." And so one way fish could get over these beaver dams is to just jump over the dams, and that can happen sometimes. More common pathways we find are they use these little side channels as perfect little fish ladders. If the dams raise the water levels up, you've got overflow side channels. Those are good migration pathways. And then, and probably less common, but we have some neat video of fish actually swimming through the interstices of these porous dams and the voids, because these aren't just solid concrete structures, right? These are structures made of that wood that we're passing around, and all sorts of mud and rocks, and so there's voids in there that they can actually swim through. So most of what I've shared with you so far paints this picture of everything that Beaver could do no wrong, and it's always a rosy picture. And anybody that's lived near a river or stream with beaver knows that that's not entirely the case. They can be an absolute nuisance. They can cause flooding. They can clog culverts. They can cut down, that tree you've been growing and are so proud of, for the past 20 years in your yard. And if you're in the irrigation business, you don't really want these guys messing around with your stuff. It turns out the most common strategy for dealing with that is to kill beaver. How effective is this? Not very. It's beaver, where there's some, there tend to be more. They come back quickly. If you have these sort of nuisance problems, you have a maintenance issue, full stop. Sometimes it's just the second people see a beaver, they want to get rid of it, and that's just kind of old habits die hard. And so you can ask the question, is this a real problem or is it perceived? But there's also these living with beaver strategies that folks like Mike Callahan have developed. There's things called beaver deceivers, which is nothing more than some fencing around a culvert to prevent them from building a dam over the culvert. You can obviously put fencing or paint on trees to keep them from, paint with a little bit of grit in it, to keep them from harvesting trees. And then pond levelers allow beaver to keep building their dam as high as they like, but the water levels don't go to the crest. Instead, they go to wherever the culvert that you put through it is. And so that's another sort of simple strategy. We're actually working with, of all folks, Walmart and the city. And some of you may have seen this pond down at the south end of town. And what this area was set aside for on Spring Creek was as a wetland and riparian mitigation for building the Walmart. And so they were supposed to be set aside to maintain some wetlands, and beaver came in here and made it a wetland that is 10 times more productive than anything we could have engineered. But there is the threat potentially to flood the roads or to not allow bigger floods to pass. And so we've been working with them to come up with some of these living with beaver strategies to potentially mitigate those. So that's a fun one in the backyard. You can go take a look at if you're curious. So that brings us to the state of many of our rivers and streams. And if we focus just on Utah, even though it's a dry state, we actually have over 85,000 miles of rivers and streams in this state. It turns out that 81% of them are these light blue areas that are intermittent and don't have flow year-round. And so if we look at just the perennial ones, these dark blue ones, we have about 16,000 miles still. It's still a lot of miles of stream. And this is historically where we would have found beaver, primarily in this perennial network. And today, at least 43% of all these streams are impaired or impacted or in a poor state. And so what do we do about that? Well, we spend a lot of money playing with Tonka toys, trying to restore these streams and rivers. And if you do a Google search when you go home for stream restoration and you click on images, the first images that come up are of Tonka toys. And as a former engineer, I can admit that these are fun things to play with. But these cost a lot of money. They rely on us knowing quite a bit about streams to actually try and reshape a channel. And a big river restoration project, how long do you think it is? How many miles of stream? Yeah. 15 miles, that would be a huge river restoration project. So we have typically a big restoration project, something on the order of 2 to 3 miles, and smaller projects are something on the order of or more typical, of maybe a quarter of a mile or something like that. And we spend on these somewhere between $200,000, $2 million per project. And so there are certainly places where this sort of stuff makes sense, but our basic thing was, well, how many miles of streams and rivers are screwed up? Can we afford this? Can we actually scale this all up? Probably not. And so beaver are not necessarily the answer to all of those rivers and streams, but we think that they are one that is particularly economical. Another thing that we're not really good at is restoring streams to be dynamic. And our science, whether we're looking at it from an ecological perspective or a geomorphic, hydrologic perspective, what we're learning about rivers and streams is that healthier ecosystems tend to be associated with rivers and streams that are more dynamic, that change, rivers that are allowed to flood, rivers that can behave like they used to, yet we're very, very poor at restoring that sort of thing. Beaver might be able to do some of that for us because they're constantly out there tinkering with these dams that they built. So applying this idea, there's some things that we can think about and sort of the rationale behind this. One is, as compared to professional engineers, beaver have a little bit more experience than us. So maybe we have a couple thousand years of engineering experience. Beaver have been building dams for at least the last, 40 to 80,000 years. So they're a little bit better track record, arguably, and for natural systems. And most of the species that are picky, beaver, I said, are an undiscriminated rodent. A lot of the species that have really specific habitat requirements, like particular fish, Bonville cutthroat trout, for example, or the sage grouse, which we mentioned, they co-evolved with these critters in the system. The low cost is probably one of the most critical arguments for this. Beaver, as of yet, have not formed a union, so for now they're cheap and free labor for us. There's a lot of media coverage in the past decade on using beaver as a restoration agent, and some of these things is from the Wall Street Journal pointing out ranchers that want beaver back on their lands, which might be a surprise to some, but they will help keep rivers or streams that might otherwise go dry in a drought, keep that flowing year-round, as well as elevating those water tables. What that does is actually increases the quality of grass and forage for their cattle. And so the news will kind of tend to latch onto this, and scientists, we may kind of imply, wow, this is new, exciting stuff. This is not a new idea at all. This is an idea that's been around for quite a while. As early, actually, as the early 1900s. This is, as an example of that, is an article from 1950 in Mechanics Illustrated of Idaho Department of Fish and Game parachuting beaver in to the Idaho wilderness. They took nuisance beaver from McCall that were flooding people's new vacation homes that they built after the war, and they had a bunch of paratroopers with way too much time on their hands and surplus parachutes and whatnot. And they came up with a system. This little guy, his name was Geronimo, they actually dropped this guy 17 times, perfecting the design, and coming up with this thing so that the crate would hold them when they're parachuting, and then when it lands, it opens up and they can crawl out and do whatever they're going to do. And this sounds sort of ridiculous, but there was actually an article published on this in the Journal of Wildlife Management, and this actually worked. It was dirt cheap. It cost them about $16 per beaver. And in 1948, they took 76 of these beaver. They only had one fatality, and they did exactly what they were hoping they would do. There's a great little NPR piece on this, and if you download the slides, there's links to that as well. So this is not a new idea. It turns out that if we want to think about beaver as a restoration tool, there's maybe three sort of general types that we could think of. One is this transplant idea, and while parachuting may not be quite as cheap today as it was in the 50s and 40s, another method is, we can move them around, obviously, with horses, with vehicles, etc. It tends to work best if you can trap the whole family unit, and by work best, who knows what this rodent's thinking and what they're going to do, but if you want them to stay in a particular area, they're more likely to stay if you can get the whole colony. It tends to work better, too, if you do it at this time of year, because this is when they're preparing for the winter, and so they won't make as big of a riskier a move. And some folks have actually found that building them little starter dams and starter lodges can increase the odds. You make it a little easier yet for them, and then they'll start with that, and they'll go, that's neat, nice try, and then they'll make it far better than we ever could. This is a bumper sticker from the Methow up in Washington, increasing stream complexity, one beaver at a time. They've got a wealth of experience, and they've transplanted hundreds and hundreds of beaver and had a hugely successful program restoring lots of tributary habitat up on the Methow. Another type of restoration would be just to take areas where you have beaver and you have good habitat and just keep a good thing going. Just promote and protect that. You could conserve them. Or if you have accidental restoration, as I'll share with you in an anecdote here, run with that. Don't fight it. And so this is Hardware Ranch. This is up Curtis Creek, up Blacksmith Fork, that the division owns. And in the mid-2000s, they came in and they built with Tonka Toys one of these classic restoration projects to take a straightened channel and re-meander it. And they made better habitat. And what happened shortly thereafter was some of the riparian vegetation recovered, and then Beaver came in 2008 and said, nice try, I can do it better. And they built on top of a lot of the structures that the division put in and built these massive dams that just completely transformed the place, created these year-round wetlands, all sorts of little niches for all sorts of critters to use, and made this a way more complicated and messy environment. And so this is a great example of accidental restoration, and the division is now sort of promoting that and showing that off as, look what we can learn from Beaver. Another way of looking at this is in places where beaver might have a hard time getting started, we might be able to help them out a little bit further. So for example, incised streams, we've been working on a bunch of incised streams, and an incised stream is just sort of a deep trench that's cut into the valley. It's hard for beaver to build dams that last through floods. And so what we've done is gone in, we've done some reinforcement of existing dams by putting little wooden fence posts in, or build little starter dams that get up a little higher than they may be able to. And this is actually working. They will come and they'll use these structures in a matter of weeks to months, and they'll come and build on them and make them better. And it just buys them a little bit of time, whereas in some of these environments, their dams may blow out with every flood. This just gives them a little bit of a head start to do that better. We've been working with a lot of ranchers on doing these sorts of techniques, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, you can go out, and we've got a display out here where if you want to play with building your own little beaver dam analog and weaving willow into these things, you can build a dam in a matter of a couple hours. It'll never be as good as what beaver will build, but it might be enough to give them a start, and then they'll take it and run with it. So a lot of these ideas are sort of summarized in some recent, there's Beaver Restoration Guidebook and some recent papers, and there's links to those in the slides if it's of interest to you. So the last thing I want to cover is where could we take some of these concepts and where could we apply them? And this is really a mapping exercise. And so we have a tool that we call BRAT, not your little brother. It's the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. And really this is just trying to help us assess where, so of those 16,000 miles of streams and rivers in Utah, where could we use beaver as a useful sort of restoration agent versus where might they be problematic? And this is one of the outputs here where we've run this for the state of Utah, and I'll walk you through what this is doing. At its heart, there's a capacity model, and what this is trying to do is not estimate how many beaver we could have, but estimate how many beaver dams. And so we go through every little segment of river and stream and ask how many beaver dams could you fit? And the colors that we're using on this map correspond to reds, where places where the habitat's worthless. Maybe there's no wood, maybe it's too steep, it's too much energy, and so those are areas that don't suit beaver. Versus, for dam building, sorry. Versus areas in blue here, you could fit up to 65 dams in a mile. That's a ridiculous amount of dams, right? But this happens, we see this. And then we have a bunch of things in between. And so what these maps are going to show, I'll show you in the next few slides, are what sort of upper limits for how many dams that landscape can support. So we'll zoom in and look here in our backyards in the Logan. And so just to orient you, this is a map. This is Cache Valley. We're sitting right here in Logan. There's the Wellsvilles. Here's the Bear River Range. And we've got the Logan River watershed, the Blacksmith Fork, and the Little Bear. And in that, we have about 436 miles of stream. And this is what the output suggests in terms of capacity. It suggests if you add up all of this, you could fit 7,400 dams. That's a ridiculous amount of dams, right? And it's actually less than we could historically. So if you are under 12 and you can tell me how many dams are actually up there right now, I have a prize if you want it. Yes. How many? Whoever gets closest. We'll try 5 of you. How many do you think are up there? 1,000, okay? Millions. I like this guy. Yeah. 2,200. 147. More conservative. Yeah. 12,000. 24. So huge range, okay? So who was it that said 1,000 in the back? So if we can pass this up the line there to her. She's closest. Turns out that there's 1,300 dams up there right now, which is probably a hell of a lot more than most of you would have thought. And so this is kind of neat for a wildlife viewing opportunity. There's tons of places to go and see these things. This is the map of where they are, and it corresponds, we're seeing the highest densities with the areas that we're predicting some of the highest capacities, which is reassuring. We also see them in some places maybe where they could cause trouble, like down by Walmart. So that's interesting. So I'm going to just skip over this for now. Another thing that we do in BRAT is we recognize that beaver aren't just going to do good everywhere. And we have a huge number of places where they could be nuisance. And so what this is trying to show, the red areas are a high probability for a conflict between human and beavers. So this is basically where we're close to roads, culverts, bridges, canals, irrigation ditches, etc. And this is ultra conservative, but it gives us a rough idea of where there might be problems. Now, we can combine those things and we can look at some preliminary management recommendations that just sort of identify, well, where might we be able to use them as a restoration tool, i.e. where are there high capacities and low conflicts, versus the areas where it can support them, but there might be conflicts, and so we might want to use some living with beaver strategies or think of those as source zones. And one of the questions you can use this for is this really pressing water resources challenge that we're facing. So we are facing a diminished snowpacks, right? And if I would have said to you before you came in here tonight, well, maybe beaver could compete with that snowpack that we're losing. And what I mean by that is maybe they could help slow down the water enough that we might be able to compete with losing the snowpack that was keeping that water releasing slowly out through the summer months. You would have laughed me out of the room. But when I tell you that there's 1,300 dams up there now and you could fit a lot more, this doesn't seem like such a preposterous suggestion. And so this is a map of kind of historic and now, well, let's call it historic, of the probability of the percent of this precipitation that we receive being snow. And so historically, 90 to 100% of everything we experienced in the Logan would have been in the form of snow, of our precipitation. And what's projected, and what we're already seeing start to happen, is a lot smaller percentage of that falls as snow. So the high peaks still have a high percentage as snow, and then we're going to see a lot more rain. What's going to happen to that rain when it falls on the landscape? How quick is it going to run off? Much, much quicker than if it falls in the form of snow and is slowly melted out. And so the idea is, could we use beaver to try to slow that down? It turns out if you look at just those restoration zones, they happen to fall in a lot of the areas that are most prone to losing some of that snowpack. And we could actually fit 4,200 dams in those areas. Right now we've got about 600 in those. And so who knows? This could be something that is a reasonable sort of mitigation strategy or a climate change adaptation strategy, and that's one of the things we're trying to play with. And of course, as I mentioned, we've got a bunch of places. There's about 500 beaver playing around in places where there might be potential conflicts, so no shortage of nuisance beaver. So if you're interested in this, we've got some displays set outside, and you can look on your own little stream that you're interested in and check these out, or you can go online and play some games with these things. So to wrap up, the things that I hope you take away from some of the stories I've shared tonight, first is that beaver are an amazing ecosystem engineer, a very industrious little rodents, and their dam building activity is something that really makes them potentially really wonderful restoration agents. The things that they do, like making big messes, can make great habitats for a lot of folks. And also, slowing down that runoff might be one of the things that might be a useful sort of tool for dealing with some of the pressing water resources challenges that we face in this state. The science that we're doing aims to try and quantify and predict these things. My wife would say it sort of death grip on the obvious, but and map these impacts. This little picture that you've seen a bunch of times, I should point out that my son took this. For all the times I've been out, looking at beaver dams, he waltzes out in the first time and takes, this wonderful photo a few years ago, and I can't get any. I have to steal them off the internet, but anyhow. There are a bunch of links on the slides to some documentaries on this stuff and a number of websites, and so again, those will be on the Science Unwrapped website. And I would be happy to answer any questions, and I'll leave up these two books that are fantastic reads if you're interested. One from 1913, the other one from a few years back. Thank you. So, question, yeah. What did the fish say when it bumped its head on a pile of logs? I don't know. Sounds like a great question for a scientist. What did he say? Good delivery on the punchline. You had a question. Damn! Oh, perfect. Very good. Damn. So could the Walmart story be extrapolated to where?
Story be extrapolated to freshwood cemetery. Can we use there, or is it too close to the road?
Potentially. I mean, what you have to do in every situation where if you've got beaver there is just sort of look at the threats, see if there's things that can be easily mitigated. And if you can tolerate leaving them there, and I'm not familiar with the situation that you're talking about, but I'd be happy to look at it with you. But the living with beaver strategies are quite transferable. They've been using these all over the country, and they've been shown to be a lot cheaper than traditional lethal control. So it's potentially viable, but without seeing that one, I wouldn't want to say. Yeah.
So when you said we started making their lodges for them,
yeah.
do you like if a beaver started making your house for you?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So he says, how you said you started making lodges for beaver, and do you think that you would like it if beaver started making a house for you? Probably not, and that's actually a really good lesson. So with the restoration side of things, one of our tendencies is to overbuild and to try and over-engineer and try and do too good of a job. And one of the things we've learned is if you just sort of get them started, they'll fix it and do a much better job than we should. So don't overbuild it.
You come in and redo the whole thing sort of?
Yeah, we don't want to decorate it and paint it for them, right? They can take care of picking out the curtains and stuff. Yeah, good question. Question up here in the back. Yeah. Sometimes, but not all the time. So the question was, if beaver leave and abandon a beaver dam or a dam complex, will another family come in and take it? One of the things when I was talking about the dynamism and things changing a lot with having beaver in the system, beaver will abandon dams for a lot of reasons. Maybe it breached or blew out. Maybe the wind blew a different direction and they just decided to pick up and move. Sometimes their dams will fill in with sediment and are no longer useful to them. Or maybe they get killed. And sometimes those dams are reoccupied by the same beaver later. Sometimes they're reoccupied by a completely different group. Or sometimes they just sort of change into a different system. And the point is, if you have a lot of this happening in a landscape, and you have beaver dams turning on and turning off, some blow out, some fail, you get a much more complex habitat. It's not just this static environment and permanent ponds. They're things that may last only a couple years, they may last 15, 20 years.
Yeah!
Wayne.
Yeah, does your model winter and don't grow enough vegetation to support 4,000 beaver days.
Yeah, so the vegetation is the primary driver of that capacity model. So we look at what vegetation is there, and that's the biggest driver of capacity. And then there's a bunch of other things like stream flow, stream power, that we're looking at. And what tends to happen is that the material that they're harvesting, the woody riparian vegetation, a lot of that, particularly aspen and willow, respond really positively to that browse pressure, and will send out lots of shoots and regrow very vigorously. Beaver are good at not just clear cutting, but selectively cutting, and then that stuff grows back quite vigorously. Yeah.
How have you discovered beaver dams affecting stream temperatures?
That's a great question. So how have we, what have we seen with beaver dams affecting stream temperatures? What most people will ask is what happens to the mean temperature of the stream? And it's probably the wrong question. And the answer is inconsistent. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes it gets hotter. Sometimes it gets cooler. A lot of folks would assume that it gets hotter because the pond is slower water, more surface area, more incoming sunlight, and so you can heat up those things. And that indeed happens. The better question is what happens to the variability of temperature. So the range of temperatures goes through the roof. You have a much narrower range without beaver dams, and then you have a much bigger range of temperatures. And what's happening is you have some areas that are indeed hotter and some areas that are cooler. One of the things we see downstream is the water pressure that's built up in these dams displaces cooler groundwater, and you can see upwelling of cooler water just downstream. And so you get more variability, and that creates potentially more hiding spots and more thermal diffusion. Yeah.
How about one more question, and then I've got a science challenge for you, and then we'll thank Joe and send you out into the halls. One question?
Go ahead.
What do beavers use their tails for?
That's a great question. What do beavers use their tails for? A number of things. Balance is really big, and then also to warn you that they're not happy with you, and warn other beaver if a predator is around. So that tail slap that they're so characteristic for, that's their way of sort of telling you, I'm not happy with you, back off, or to warn other beaver. There's other things, but those are the two big ones.
Okay, so we have a Facebook page for Science Unwrapped, and sometimes after our programs, people do things at home or do things outdoors, and then they post it. They send us pictures and they tell us what they did. So if you want to do a little follow-up science exploration on beavers, we invite you to do that. Go out with your family, take a little hike on one of these streams and count beaver dams. Or go use Joe's program and see where beavers are supposed to be and see if you find them there and take a picture of their dams. Or go find a beaver dam and see what it looks like, see if you can find different kinds. So if you're interested in doing that, please let us know on Facebook, and then we can see what everyone learns. And let's thank Joe, and then